He was just an old army vet on his way home, stuck in traffic like everyone else. But up ahead, two men were locked in a violent fight, and in the middle was someone desperately trying to get away. Frank Delaney didn't plan to get involved until instinct took over. What happened next stopped an attack, saved a life, and uncovered a secret that would rock a national courtroom weeks later. He thought it was just another commute, until he realized who he had just saved and why dangerous people wanted him gone forever. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The late afternoon sun hung low over the interstate, washing the lanes in a muted gold that turned every windshield into a flickering mirror. Frank Delaney sat behind the wheel of his 20-year-old Ford pickup, the engine's steady hum vibrating faintly through the worn leather seat, his hands still broad and steady despite the years. Rested lightly at the 10 and 2 positions out of habit more than necessity. It was the same posture he had used in convoys decades earlier, guiding heavier, more valuable loads through roads far less predictable than this suburban stretch of asphalt. The air carried the faint scent of motor oil and dust, a smell that never bothered him. Traffic had been creeping along for the better part of 20 minutes, brake lights glowing in staggered patterns ahead. He could hear the muffled bass of someone's stereo leaking from a car 2 lanes over, and the impatient tap of a turn signal clicked from the sedan in front of him. Frank had long since learned the art of waiting, of reading the subtle movements of other drivers before they made their choices. A glance in his side mirror showed a young man in a sports car weaving between lanes, searching for the smallest opening to squeeze through. Frank shook his head, not with judgment, but with the quiet recognition of a rhythm he no longer lived by. His window was rolled halfway down, letting in a breeze that tugged gently at the brim of his cap. It was a faded olive drab, the embroidered insignia almost threadbare from years of wear. A few drivers glanced at it as they passed, though most kept their eyes forward, lost in phone calls or the glow of dashboard screens. The world had gotten faster, he thought, but not in any way that made people more patient. Ahead, the line of cars shifted and rolled forward a few yards, only to brake again. Frank eased his foot from the gas and let the truck coast, keeping a generous space between himself and the vehicle in front. The gaps drew the occasional honk from behind, but he ignored them. In the service, you learn to keep your distance, not just for reaction time, but for perspective. A tight formation had its place, but here, on a crowded stretch of state highway, he preferred the space to think. He scanned the vehicles around him with the same calm, methodical attention he once used on perimeter patrol. The battered minivan to his left was crammed with grocery bags, a child's hand pressed to the rear window as it traced shapes in the glass. To the right, a delivery van inched forward, its driver sipping from a paper cup and tapping the steering wheel in time with music Frank couldn't hear. Each scene passed like a slide in a reel, fragments of other lives he would never know beyond this moment in traffic. The dashboard clock read for 32. Somewhere ahead, a traffic light was holding hundreds of vehicles in place. Somewhere beyond, that may be a stalled car or an accident, though he saw no flashing lights yet. Patience was in short supply among the drivers around him. A horn blared abruptly from behind as a motorcycle cut between lanes, its engine's growl rising sharply, before fading into the distance. Frank barely moved, his eyes steady on the ripple of motion that disturbance caused. The subtle shifts of brake lights and mirrors as people reacted. He thought about stopping at the diner just past the next exit, the one where the coffee was. Cheap, and the waitress still remembered his order after all these years. Maybe traffic would ease by the time he finished a cup. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, it was a better use of time than letting frustration build behind the wheel. A semi rumbled past in the opposite direction, its air brakes sighing as it slowed for an upcoming light. Frank watched it go, the trailers sighed, reflecting a distorted image of the slow-moving cars in his lane. The hum of engines around him felt almost like background noise, a steady current he had drifted into without resistance. When the brake lights ahead flickered and the line of cars inched forward again, he followed unhurried. This was the pace of the day, and there was no changing it. Somewhere, in this mass of steel and glass, people were trying to get home, to make appointments, to escape the press of other lives around them. He was just another part of the flow, but unlike most, he didn't mind the delay. Years of moving through tense, unpredictable situations had taught him that calm was a choice. And here, boxed in by strangers on all sides, it was one he made. Without effort, the world beyond the windshield could churn and rush, but inside the cab of his truck, Frank kept his own tempo steady, measured, and ready for whatever the road might place in front of him next. The crawl of traffic gave Frank plenty of time to scan the road ahead, his eyes drifting beyond the line of brake lights to where the shoulder widened near an intersection. At first, it was just a break in the rhythm. Two cars pulled off at a sharper angle than seemed necessary, their bumpers almost touching. But as the gap between vehicles shifted and the late afternoon light caught the scene, he noticed movement. Two men were standing just outside their driver's doors, their bodies squared toward each other in a way that spoke less of conversation and more of confrontation. The noise reached him in bursts, carried unevenly over the hum of engines and the occasional blare of a horn. Words weren't clear yet, but the tone was. Sharp, clipped, and full of heat, they gestured with quick, cutting motions, hands rising and falling like punctuation marks in an argument that had already passed the point of civility. Traffic in the right lane slowed even more as drivers craned their necks to see. A few had their windows down, letting the noise spill into the crawl of cars. Then Frank saw the third figure, smaller, partially hidden between the two men, pressed back against the hood of one of the vehicles as if the metal might shield them. The person's head turned from side to side, following the back and forth like someone trapped in a storm of voices with no shelter in sight. They didn't speak, at least not loudly enough for Frank to hear over the traffic. But their posture told its own story, shoulders drawn in, one hand raised slightly in what looked like an instinctive barrier. The men were close enough now that he could see their faces when they stepped into the sunlight breaking through the trees. One was tall and broad, his jaw set hard, eyes narrowed to slits. The other was leaner, with a tense, forward-leaning stance, his words coming fast enough to make his chest rise and fall with each breath. The air between them seemed to hum with the kind of energy that didn't fade on its own. Cars around Frank began to maneuver, some drivers edging into the next lane to give the scene a wide berth, others slowing even more to get a better look. The space around the stopped cars became an island in the flow of traffic, vehicles partying just enough to leave the confrontation exposed but untouched. Frank's gaze lingered on the person caught in the middle. They shifted slightly, pressing a hand to the hood of the car behind them, as if steadying themselves. It wasn't the nervous pacing of someone equally involved in the argument. It was the rigid stillness of someone who didn't want to be there at all. He'd seen that look before, in places far from this crowded road. It was the look of someone caught between forces they couldn't match, hoping the tension would break without pulling them in. A sharp movement from the broader man drew Frank's attention. His arm came up suddenly, not quite striking, but close enough to make the third person flinch. The leaner man stepped forward in response, voice rising, and the air filled with a sharper edge to the noise. Even at this distance, Frank could feel. The shift to the argument was no longer about words. The light up ahead turned red, bringing his lane to a stop. From where he sat now, the scene was in clear view through the open stretch of road between cars. The trapped figure's eyes darted toward the passing traffic as though measuring the chances of escape. No one slowed enough to intervene. Drivers kept moving, their gazes flicking back to the safety of their own lanes. Frank rested one hand on the steering wheel, the other on the worn gear shift, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The noises were clearer now, harsh shouts layered. Over the mechanical tick of cooling engines and the distant wail of an unseen siren somewhere far away, his eyes shifted between the two aggressors, the small space between them, and the person pinned inside it all. The truck's engine idled steadily beneath him, the vibration familiar and grounding. The decision wasn't a loud one. It came quietly, the way some things always had for him. He'd been here before in different forms, not on a sunlit highway, but in places where stepping forward was the only option that made sense. He watched the tall man's shoulders bunch and the leaner man step closer, the distance between them closing another inch. That was enough for Frank to push his foot from the brake and ease the truck toward the shoulder, his eyes never leaving the narrow, tense space where all three stood. The tires hummed as they crossed the rumble strip, the vibration running up through the floorboards and into Frank's boots. Gravel crunched under the truck's weight when he eased it onto the narrow shoulder, the noise oddly separate from the soundscape of honking horns and idling engines. The decision to stop hadn't felt like a choice. It was more like something his body remembered before his mind had. Fully caught up, the scene ahead stayed in his direct line of sight. The taller man's frame loomed over the third person, his arm still cutting through the air in sharp, aggressive motions. The leaner man was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Moving closer with every step, his voice raised enough now for the words to blur into something raw and jagged. Frank's focus narrowed in the way it used to during patrols, where everything extraneous faded and only the essential details remained. He cut the engine and took a steadying breath, the faint tang of oil and dust in the cabin grounding him. The air was cooler outside the truck, the breeze carrying the smell of exhaust and faint traces of hot asphalt. It was the kind of sensory imprint that could pull a man backward in time if he let it. For a split second, he wasn't looking at a roadside dispute. He was seeing a checkpoint in another country, under another sun, with different stakes but the same tension humming in the air. His knees straightened slowly as he stepped down. From the cab, the movement deliberate. Muscle memory guided his posture, head up, shoulders squared, arms relaxed but ready. Years ago, those small adjustments had meant the difference between escalation and control. He didn't need to think about it. His body already knew. The weight of his boots on the gravel, the angle of his steps, even the pace of his breathing. All of it settled into a rhythm drilled into him through repetition. Frank scanned the space between the vehicles and the edge of traffic, noting angles, escape routes, and the positions of each person. He was already assessing distances the way he used to read terrain, his eyes catching the subtle flex of the taller man's hand as it hovered too close to the third person's shoulder. The leaner man's stance was more reactive, all coiled, energy and quick shifts. Neither had noticed him yet. Voices sharpened in his ears. Not the actual words, those didn't matter yet, but the cadence. The rise and fall that signaled when someone was running out of patience and moving toward action. That cadence was the same in every language, in every setting he had ever been in. The trapped figure's voice, if there was one, was still lost under the others. Their stillness spoke more than anything else could. Frank's boots carried him. Forward, each step, even and unhurried, a pace meant to signal presence without provocation. He knew better than to rush in. Fast movements could draw fast reactions. This was about taking control of the air between them, slowing it down enough for words to fit where fists were about to land. In the corner of his awareness, cars kept rolling past, a few drivers casting curious glances, but no one slowing enough to help. That had been true in other places too. Bystanders holding back, unsure or unwilling to break into a situation already burning hot. Frank didn't hold it against them. Not everyone was wired to step forward. The taller man shifted again, and Frank caught a flicker of something metallic near his hip. It was a glint no bigger than a thumbnail, but it tightened the space in his chest. His stride adjusted subtly, angling to bring him closer to the trapped figure first, then into the line between them. Old instincts weren't about heroics or bravado. They were about calculation, how to read hands, eyes, and shoulders, how to see what might happen before it did, how to take away the one advantage that could turn a standoff into harm. The closer he came, the more he felt his pulse slow, not quicken. The years had taken some things from him, but the ability to hold his ground under pressure wasn't one of them. By the time the taller man noticed him, Frank was close enough to be heard without raising his voice. That was deliberate too. A calm tone forced people to listen differently. It disrupted the rhythm of a fight before the next beat could land. His shadow stretched into their space as he stepped fully off the shoulder, gravel crunching underfoot, the voices faltering just enough to give him the opening he needed. The air between the two men snapped like a taut wire. Without warning, the taller one stepped in hard, his hand gripping the front of the other man's shirt. The motion was fast and forceful, a sudden release of everything that had been coiling. In his stance, the shove drove the leaner man backward until his lower back hit the edge of the hood with a dull metallic thud. The sound carried in the small pocket of space around the cars, sharp enough to make the third figure flinch and draw in on themselves even more. Frank felt his jaw tighten. That was the point where arguments turned into something else entirely. when words stopped mattering and momentum became the deciding factor. He closed the distance by another step, the weight of his boots steady on the gravel, eyes locked on the taller man's hands. That's when he caught it, a quick, cold glint in the afternoon light, just a fraction of a second, like sunlight. Catching on glass, it was in the man's right fist, partially hidden by his grip, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The shine was too clean to be a coin or a key. It was the flat, cold reflection of metal worn smooth, with "Use the angle of the man's fingers," told Frank it wasn't just being held. It was ready. He didn't need to know exactly what it was yet. What mattered was that the hand holding it was tense, knuckles pale, the muscles in the forearm drawn tight as wire. The leaner man tried to twist away, his hands up now in a defensive, half gesture that barely made it between them. His back scraped against the hood, the metal creaking faintly under the pressure. The taller one leaned in, voice low but edged, the kind of tone that didn't need volume to communicate its intent. Frank shifted his position, angling his step so his approach wouldn't be seen until he was closer. His mind cataloged details without conscious effort. The taller man's stance was solid but forward-heavy, weight on the balls of his feet, which made him aggressive but unbalanced if pulled off center. The leaner man's left foot was trapped behind the wheel well, cutting off his ability to sidestep. The third figure, still pressed near the space between the cars, had turned slightly toward the traffic, eyes wide and scanning like someone looking for a way out that didn't exist. The metallic glint caught the light again when the taller man adjusted his grip. This time, Frank saw more of it, a narrow shaft with a blunt squared end, not a knife, but heavy enough to do damage. A tire iron, maybe a short wrench. In the wrong hands, it was no less dangerous than a blade. Traffic kept moving, the steady rumble of engines and tires swallowing the scene so completely that anyone more than a few yards away might not even notice what was happening. But here, in this small, tense circle, every sound felt amplified, the faint rasp of fabric stretching, the muted pop of the taller man's knuckles flexing, the shallow, quick breaths of the man pinned against the hood. Frank adjusted his pace again, each step measured to keep his approach unhurried but inevitable. His eyes never left the metallic object, tracking it the way he would have followed the barrel of a weapon in another life. His breathing stayed slow, his voice still unspoken, waiting for the moment. When entering the space would carry the most weight, the taller man's free hand pushed at the leaner man's shoulder, pinning him harder against the car. That motion exposed the metal in his fist completely, the sunlight flashing across it in a way that left no doubt. The leaner man's head turned toward the blow that hadn't yet come, instinctively bracing for it. That was the breaking point for Frank. He closed the last few steps between them, the crunch of his boots on gravel finally cutting into their focus. His shadow fell across the hood, reaching both men at once. The taller one's head turned just enough to register his presence, and for a heartbeat, the motion of his arm stalled. Frank's eyes met his, steady and unblinking, his voice ready to break the moment before the swing could. The metal in the man's fist gleamed one last time in the light, before the air shifted toward whatever was coming next. Frank closed the remaining distance with the kind of pace that carried intent without haste, his boots sinking slightly into the uneven gravel. Every step was deliberate, the way he used to approach tense checkpoints overseas, enough presence to be noticed, enough calm to keep the wrong kind of attention from sparking. The taller man still had the leaner one pinned against the hood, the tire iron glinting in his fist, his shoulders bunched with the energy of someone ready to commit. To whatever came next, Frank drew in a breath through his nose, feeling the air sharpen in his chest, and let his voice cut across the space. It wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of one. That's enough. The tone was steady, low, and flat, with no room for question. Years ago, that voice had been the difference between a crowd listening and a crowd breaking apart. It didn't ask, it told. Both men froze just long enough for the air to shift. The leaner man's eyes flicked toward Frank first, reading him the way someone reads the sudden arrival of a new player in a dangerous game. The taller man's grip stayed firm, his jaw tightening, but his focus wavered for a split second, a small but important change. Frank stepped closer, angling himself so that his frame filled the gap between the trapped figure and the aggressor's line of sight. Let him go. Frank said, his eyes locked on the taller man's, not the weapon. Looking at the weapon made people defensive. Looking at them made them decide what they wanted to do next. His voice was calm enough to be disarming, but there was no mistaking the steel under it. The taller man's lips curled in something between a sneer and a smirk, a reaction Frank had seen countless times from people who measured strength only. By size, he shifted his stance slightly, as if testing whether Frank would flinch. Frank didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't raise his voice. He simply held the man's gaze, the silence between them carrying its own kind of pressure. Traffic rolled by only a few feet away, drivers catching fragments of the scene before speeding on. The noise of engines and wind over the asphalt filled the edges of the moment, but here in this narrow strip of roadside, the sound felt muted. Frank could hear the faint rasp of the trapped man's breath, quick and shallow, and the tiny scrape of metal against metal as the tire iron shifted in the taller man's grip. Let him go. This time, Frank's tone dropped half a register. Each word separated just enough to land on its own. He took another step forward, closing the space until the taller man would have to move back to keep hold of his target. The shift in proximity forced the man to adjust, his shoulders angling, his stance less certain than before. The leaner man took the opportunity to twist slightly, breaking some of the tension in the grip on his shirt. Frank didn't break eye contact with the aggressor, reading the small shifts in his breathing, the subtle flex of his knuckles. The man's bravado was starting to fray at the edges. "You don't want to do this," Frank said, softer now, almost conversational. The words were simple, but the delivery was measured, the kind that left a person uncertain whether they were being warned or offered a way out. That uncertainty was often enough to make them pause. The taller man's eyes flicked toward the passing traffic, then back to Frank, as if measuring whether anyone else might stop. The weapon in his hand dipped a fraction, his grip loosening without him fully deciding to drop it. Frank noticed but didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he took one last step into the man's space, close enough that the decision had to be made. Now, the aggressor's jaw worked once before he shoved the leaner man away. The motion rough, but not aimed to harm further. The tire iron hung at his side now, the thread in it dulled, but not gone. Frank stayed where he was, his body between them, his gaze steady. "Walk away," he said. It wasn't a challenge. It was an instruction. The taller man held his stare for another beat, then stepped back toward his car without another word. The space between them widened. But Frank didn't turn his back until the man's hand was on his driver's door and the weapon was out of sight. Only then did he shift his attention to the person he had just pulled out of the line of fire. The air still thick with the residue of what had almost happened. The moment the taller man's eyes met Frank's, something in the air seemed to slow. The aggressor still had the tire iron loose in his grip, his weight forward, his jaw set in the kind of locked defiance Frank had seen plenty of times before. But there was also a flicker, not fear, not yet, but recognition. It was the look of someone realizing they were no longer the most certain man in the space. Frank didn't step back, didn't glance away, and didn't fill the silence with extra words. He simply stood his ground, shoulders squared, feet planted as if the gravel under him were solid concrete. Years had added lines to his face and silver to his hair, but none of that had softened the way he carried himself. His spine stayed straight, his chest forward, his weight balanced in that unshakable way drilled into him long before this afternoon. The stance wasn't aggressive, but it was immovable, the kind of posture that said plainly, "I will not yield." It was paired with a voice that didn't rise, but settled into the air like an anchor. The taller man adjusted his grip on the tire iron, as though reminding himself he still had it, but the movement lacked the conviction of a few moments ago. Frank didn't need to raise his hands or threaten. His tone did the work for him. There was no hurry in his words, no strain in his voice, and that calmness forced the aggressor to measure himself against it. Beyond them, traffic crept past, drivers slowing just enough to catch a glimpse. Faces appeared in windshields and side windows, eyes tracking the scene, some with faint curiosity, others with cautious interest. Yet no one opened a door, no one honked to disrupt it. The cars in the closest lanes formed a quiet boundary, idling. In place, the drivers watching from the insulated safety of glass and metal. The crowd remained still, their silence as much a part of the moment as the heat radiating off the pavement. Frank's gaze didn't waver. He read the man in front of him the way he used to size up someone at a gate, not just what they were holding, but how they held it. The aggressor's chest rose and fell a little faster now, a faint tell that his adrenaline was mixing with uncertainty. That was the opening Frank had been waiting for. Not to move in, but to stand firmer. He knew the right presence could press, harder than any physical push. The leaner man, freed from the worst of the grip, still leaned against the hood, rubbing the place on his chest where the fabric had been bunched and pulled. His eyes darted between Frank and the taller man, and then to the stalled cars beyond, as if looking for a break in the moment he could use to step away entirely. "Put it down," Frank said, his voice low but deliberate, not shouted, not repeated. In panic, just a clear instruction. The words hung in the air long enough that the taller man had to choose whether to obey or ignore them outright. For a few seconds, neither happened. He stayed rooted, the tire iron still dangling, his jaw still tight, but the aggression in his shoulders had thinned. Inside the nearest car, a woman in the driver's seat had her phone lifted slightly. Recording in another, a man had his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if bracing for something to happen. But nothing did. The crowd didn't press in or disperse. They simply hovered, silent witnesses to a standoff where the balance had shifted. The taller man glanced away for the first time, his eyes flicking toward the line of traffic. That small break in focus was as loud to Frank as a shouted concession. A man who was sure of himself didn't look away, didn't check for an audience. Frank stepped forward once more, slow and steady, closing that last bit of space until the weapon's reach wouldn't matter unless the man was willing to make a reckless choice. The aggressor's knuckles flexed, the metal in his hand tilting, slightly downward. His breathing eased just enough to be noticeable. Frank didn't push the moment. He let the silence work, knowing the weight of the onlooker's eyes and his own unshaken stance were pulling the man toward a decision. When the tire iron finally lowered, it wasn't thrown or dropped, it was just set aside in the smallest gesture of retreat, the man's arm loosening as if the fight had leaked out of it entirely. Frank didn't smile or nod in victory. He simply stayed where he was, his presence still holding the space, while the idling cars remained frozen, watching what they likely wouldn't forget anytime soon. Frank stepped fully into the narrow space between the two men, the shift in position forcing them apart without the need for physical contact. His boots ground softly against the gravel, the sound subtle but deliberate, a reminder that he was there and staying there. He placed himself just far enough from each man to block a direct lunge, his shoulders turned slightly toward the taller one, the one whose hand still lingered near the tire iron. Every inch of his posture was angled to make clear where his attention lay. The leaner man, now with a little breathing room, straightened against the hood, one hand rubbing absently at his sternum. He kept glancing at the weapon in the other man's hand, then at Frank, as if silently urging him to do something more. Frank didn't rush. Quick moves had a way of reigniting sparks. This wasn't about winning a contest of speed, it was about changing the rhythm of what had been building. "Take a step back," Frank said, his tone measured. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a barked command either. The words carried the weight of someone who expected to be listened to. But without the heat that could push a man into doubling down, the taller man's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching, but his feet stayed planted. Frank kept his gaze steady, not on the man's face alone, but on his hands, the angle of his elbows, the tension in his forearms. Years of reading body language told him more than any words could. The taller man's breathing was still elevated, but not as ragged as before. The weapon stayed in his grip, held loosely now, though Frank knew how quickly that could change. "Whatever you think you're going to do with that," Frank continued, voice calm but edged with finality, "it's not going to go the way you think." The statement was plain, without threat or bravado, and that was what made it land. Around them, the muted hum of traffic filled the air, along with the faint ticking of cooling engines from the two parked cars. Frank could feel eyes on them from the vehicles edging past. The drivers slowed to a crawl as they tried to piece together what they were seeing. The bystanders stayed inside their cars, maybe out of fear, maybe out of uncertainty, but their attention gave the moment a certain weight. The taller man had to know he was being watched. Frank kept his stance relaxed, but rooted. His arms hung loosely at his sides, ready to move if needed, but not telegraphing aggression. His voice didn't rise or falter as he spoke again. "You've got a choice here. You can back away, or you can try something you'll regret." "I'd pick the first one." He let the words settle, giving the man space to think about them. The leaner man exhaled slowly, the sound carrying in the stillness. He shifted slightly to the side, creating more distance between himself and the taller man, and Frank adjusted to maintain the line between them. The taller man's eyes darted briefly toward the road, then back to Frank, then down at the ground. "For just a heartbeat? You're done here," Frank said, the firmness in his voice now clear as a locked door. The taller man's grip on the tire iron loosened another fraction, his shoulders easing just enough to show the fight was leaking out of him. Still, Frank didn't look away, didn't give him the chance to think that hesitation meant weakness. Finally, with a small shake of his head, the taller man stepped back a pace. The tire iron hung low in his hand, no longer poised for use. Frank matched the retreat with a small forward step of his own, ensuring the space remained filled by his presence, not left open to close again. The leaner man straightened fully now, glancing at Frank with a mix of relief and disbelief. The tension hadn't fully broken. It still hung there, like static in the air, but the edge of it had dulled. Frank's calm, unshaken voice had shifted the momentum, and for the first time since pulling over, the threat felt like it might actually recede. The taller man's grip shifted just enough for the light to hit the metal fully, no longer just a fleeting glint in the corner of Frank's vision. Now it was plain, the squared, flat end, the long, solid shaft, the weight of it obvious, even from a few feet away. A tire iron, not a sharp weapon, but one that could break bone or worse with a single swing. Frank had seen worse things in tighter quarters, but this was still the kind of tool that could turn a roadside argument into something irreversible in seconds. He didn't move toward it. Closing the gap too quickly could trigger instinct, and the man holding it still had the kind of posture that suggested he'd swing first and think later. Instead, Frank let his own stance anchor the moment, planting himself so firmly that it became harder for the other man to picture getting past him. The silence between them stretched just long enough for the background noises, idling engines, the low murmur of drivers in nearby cars to seep back into focus. "You're holding the wrong solution," Frank said evenly, nodding once toward the tire iron, but not taking his eyes off the man's face. It wasn't a direct challenge, it was a reframing. He wanted the man to see the tool in his hand as a bad answer, not a piece of leverage. The aggressor's eyes flicked down to it, then back up, his jaw still tight. Frank shifted his weight slightly, a subtle move that brought his lead foot half an inch forward and his shoulders into an angle that blocked the man's line toward the leaner figure behind him. At the same time, his voice stayed calm, steady, the tone of someone who had been in tense places before and had no intention of losing his footing now. "You're already being watched. You swing that, and the only direction this goes is worse for you." The taller man's eyes darted toward the line of slow-moving traffic, where faces were visible in passing windows. Some people were watching outright. Others were stealing glances as they crept forward. That awareness made him pause, the tire iron dipping slightly before his grip tightened again. Frank recognized the flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't surrender yet, but it was a crack in the wall. He didn't push forward physically. Instead, he let his words do the work. "Put it down yourself. That way, you're still making the choice. You let someone take it from you. That choice is gone." The phrasing was intentional. A man clinging to control was more likely to respond to the idea of keeping it than to a demand for compliance. The aggressor's breathing slowed just a fraction, the fight in his shoulders tempered by calculation. The leaner man behind Frank shifted slightly, trying to edge further from the hood of the car. But Frank lifted one hand slightly without looking back, a silent signal to hold position and let the moment play out. The tire iron dipped again. This time, lingering low, Frank didn't step in to grab it. That would have meant contact, and contact could reignite what he was working to dissolve. Instead, he kept his hands at his sides and his voice level. "Just drop it by your feet. Walk back to your car. That's all it takes to end this." There was a long pause, the kind that stretches a heartbeat into 10. Then, with a sudden exhale, the man let the tire iron fall from his hand. It landed on the gravel with a muted clink, rolling a few inches before settling. Frank didn't break eye contact, even as the weapon lay harmless at their feet. The taller man took a step back, his hands now empty, but his pride still taut. Frank let him have the space, holding his position until the man began to edge toward his own vehicle. Only when the driver's side door opened did Frank shift slightly, his body no longer blocking the view of the man he'd just protected. The tire iron stayed where it had fallen, inert now, its danger neutralized without a single touch. The taller man's retreat left an unusual kind of silence in his wake. It wasn't quiet exactly, the rumble of passing traffic still rolled steadily by. And somewhere farther down the road, a car horn blared impatiently, but the sharp edge of the moment had dulled. The tire iron lay on the gravel near Frank's boot, harmless now, though its presence still felt heavy. Frank's eyes stayed on the taller man until the car door shut and the engine turned over. Only then, shifting his attention to the one who had been pinned against the hood, the younger man was still half leaning on the car as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His hands braced against the metal, fingers splayed wide. And his skin had the pallor of someone who'd been caught between fight and flight, with no room for either. Beads of sweat clung to his temples, despite the coolness of the late afternoon air. His breathing came in short, controlled bursts, like he was trying to keep from showing just how rattled he was. "You all right?" Frank asked, his voice quieter now. The authority dialed down, but the steadiness still there. The man swallowed. Before answering, his Adam's apple shifting visibly. Yeah, I'm fine." The words were automatic, unconvincing. He straightened slowly, as if testing his own balance, and gave a quick shake of his head, like he was trying to clear it. Frank studied him for a beat, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the departing car and then quickly away. "Looked like more than just an argument," he said evenly. It wasn't an accusation, more of an open door. The younger man's gaze flicked to Frank for only a second before dropping to the ground. "Just got out of hand," he muttered. His voice was low enough that Frank had to lean in slightly. To catch it, it's nothing. Nothing rarely left a man pressed against the hood of a car with someone's fist twisted in his shirt and a weapon close enough to use. Frank didn't press, but he didn't entirely let it go either. That nothing had a tire iron behind it. The man shifted uncomfortably, pushing his hands into his jacket pockets, as though to anchor them. "I can handle it." It was the kind of line that sounded rehearsed, not from confidence, but from necessity. Frank nodded slowly, his eyes still on him. "You don't have to tell me anything. You don't want to. Just make sure you're safe." The younger man gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes focused somewhere over Frank's shoulder, as if measuring the distance to his own car door. The light breeze caught the loose strands of his hair, and Frank noticed a faint mark near the collar of his shirt, the start of a bruise, maybe, or the impression from where the fabric had been pulled tight. It was small, but it added weight to the unease that was already plain in his posture. From the line of cars, Frank could feel eyes still watching, but they were softer now, the tension having drained from the scene. The younger man shifted again, glancing toward his vehicle like he was waiting for permission to leave. "You know him?" Frank asked, tilting his head toward the space where the taller man's car had been moments before. A pause. "No," the younger man said, too quickly. He adjusted his stance, his feet angling slightly toward the open driver's door of his own car. "Thanks for stepping in, I owe you one." The words were polite, but they had the clipped quality of someone trying to close a conversation without giving anything more away. Frank held his gaze for a moment, then stepped back just enough to let him pass. The younger man moved quickly, sliding into his car without looking back. The engine started, and a moment later he merged into the slow-moving traffic, disappearing into the steady stream of vehicles like nothing had happened at all. Frank stayed there on the shoulder for a few seconds longer, the wind carrying the faint smell of hot metal from the cars that had been parked so close together. Something about the man's reluctance stayed with him, heavier than the brief confrontation had been. There was more to the story. He didn't need to push now to know that, but whatever it was, the man clearly wasn't ready to share. It and that, in Frank's experience, often meant the trouble wasn't over. The first wail of the siren reached Frank as a faint, rising note beneath the steady hum of passing traffic. It was distant, threading through the air like something carried on the wind. but it was enough to shift the balance of the moment. The younger man, still pale and restless in his posture, glanced toward the sound before quickly looking away. Frank's eyes stayed on the taller man, whose shoulders stiffened at the noise. That subtle change told him the sirens were no coincidence. The pitch of the sound grew sharper, closer, the Doppler's swell unmistakable now. Frank didn't move from where he stood on the shoulder, but he saw the calculation flicker across the aggressor's face. It was the look of someone weighing the risk, of staying against the risk of running, and the decision came quickly. Without a word, the taller man's gaze cut past Frank toward his own vehicle. Parked at a slant on the gravel, he took a step back, then another, never fully turning his back until he had put a few paces between them. His eyes, still locked on Frank's, but whatever bravado had been there minutes earlier, was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Not fear exactly, but a readiness to abandon the ground entirely. The tire iron, discarded earlier, stayed where it lay, its dull metal catching the afternoon light in a lifeless glimmer. The sirens grew louder, threading through the uneven rhythm of idling engines in traffic. Somewhere beyond the nearest line of cars, drivers began glancing in their mirrors, adjusting their positions to make way. The sound bounced off the surrounding buildings and trees, filling the narrow roadside space until it seemed to press against the back of Frank's neck. The aggressor moved faster now, crossing the gap to his vehicle in long, purposeful strides. He yanked the driver's door open, the hinges creaking faintly, and slid inside without looking toward the younger man or the weapon on the ground. Frank stayed still, tracking each movement but making no move to follow. He knew the kind of exit this was, quick enough to avoid questions, calculated enough to make it clear he wasn't going to stick around to be the subject of anyone's report. The engine turned over hard, the rev loud in the close air, and gravel sprayed from the tires as the car lurched into motion. The vehicle straightened into the right lane with an abrupt jerk, slotting into a break in traffic as if it had been waiting for the gap. The sirens, now close enough to echo in the hollow between buildings, seemed to chase the sound of his acceleration. Within moments, the car's taillights merged into the steady flow ahead, vanishing behind a bend in the road before the first patrol vehicle came into view. Frank stood where he was, the faint dust from the gravel settling around his boots. The younger man was already edging toward his own car, his movements quick but quiet, as if he could slip away unnoticed even in plain sight. Frank didn't stop him. His focus shifted to the flashing blue and red lights cresting the rise 100 yards down the road. The lead cruiser slowed as it approached, its siren dropping to a lower pitch before cutting off entirely. A second followed close behind, both vehicles pulling onto the shoulder with practiced precision. The officers stepped out almost in unison, scanning the scene, their eyes moving from Frank to the younger man, then to the empty patch of gravel, where the taller man's car had been dot by then. The fleeing vehicle was long gone, swallowed by the tangle of city streets beyond the intersection. Frank knew the odds of anyone catching him now were slim. A man who left that quickly, with sirens still blocks away, probably knew the back roads well enough to vanish before a plate number could be called in. One of the officers approached Frank, a question already forming on his face, while the other moved toward the younger man. Frank glanced once at the place where the tire iron still lay in the gravel, unmoved since it left the aggressor's hand, and thought briefly about how fast things could go from dangerous to empty space. The sirens had pushed the danger out of sight, but they hadn't erased it, not from the road, and certainly not from whatever had started this in the first place. The officer who approached Frank was tall, with a patrol cap pulled low enough to cast a shadow over his eyes. His radio crackled at his shoulder as he came to a stop a few feet away, boots crunching on the gravel. "Sir, you want to tell me what happened here?" His tone was even not accusatory, but clearly gauging the scene as much as he was listening to Frank's answer. Frank straightened slightly without thinking about it, the habit of standing at attention ingrained deep enough that it came as naturally as breathing. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted a fraction, and his hands settled loosely at his sides. "To men," he began, his voice steady, "pulled over here on the shoulder. One of them was holding a tire iron and had the other pinned against the hood of a car. I intervened before it escalated. You saw the weapon in his hand." "Yes," Frank said. He nodded toward the dull metal lying a few feet away. The officer's partner, who had been speaking to the younger man, broke off briefly to glance at the object, then bent to pick it up, using a gloved hand. It was held up for a quick inspection before being set in an evidence bag. Frank noted the care in the movement, not rushed, not careless. These were officers who understood that details mattered. "Did you know either of the individuals involved?" the first officer asked. "No," Frank replied simply. "Never seen them before today." The questions came in a calm, methodical sequence. Where was he positioned when he first noticed the vehicles? How close did he get before stepping in? Did he hear what they were arguing about? Frank answered each one in turn, his voice never rising, never slipping into speculation. When he described what he had seen, he kept it to what he'd directly observed: the angles, the movements, the tension in their stances. Without adding assumptions, the officer's pen moved steadily over a small notebook, but every so often his gaze would lift to meet Frank's, as if measuring not just the words, but the man saying them. Frank knew that look. It was the kind of silent assessment he'd once given to new recruits, checking for steadiness, for the ability to recount a situation without the blur of adrenaline distorting it. The partner returned from speaking to the younger man and gave a small shake of his head. "Says he doesn't want to file a complaint. Won't give a name for the other guy." The first officer let out a quiet breath, then looked back at Frank. "Sounds like you might be the only cooperative witness here," in what was almost a smile. "I'll give you what I can." The officer seemed to weigh that, then nodded. "You military retired Army," Frank said. 22 years. That drew a faint shift in the officer's posture, a subtle easing of the shoulders. Clear, straight lines makes our job a lot easier. Frank didn't comment on that. He simply finished answering the rest of their questions, walking them through the order of events from the moment he spotted the cars to the moment the aggressor drove away. When the last detail was noted and the small pad tucked away, the officer extended a hand. Frank took it, the grip firm, the exchange brief. "Appreciate you stepping in," the officer said. Not everyone would have. Frank gave a short nod. Sometimes you don't get to decide. You just see what's in front of you and act. They parted with a quiet understanding. The officers had their notes, their evidence bag, and whatever they could take from the younger man's guarded account. Frank had given his piece and knew it would stand on its own. As the patrol cars idled with their lights still flashing, he stepped back toward his pickup. The cool breeze carrying the fading scent of hot asphalt and the low murmur of police radios. The moment had passed, but the shape of it, the faces, the stance, the weight of the air would stay clear in his mind for a long while yet. The younger man lingered near his car, one hand resting lightly on the door handle, as though he was already half in the motion of leaving. The flashing lights from the patrol cars cast brief streaks of red and blue across his face, and in those shifting colors, Frank could see the uneven lines of tension in his expression. When the officers stepped away to speak quietly near their cruisers, the man straightened and crossed the few steps toward Frank. "Thanks," he said, extending his hand. The word was short, almost abrupt, but it carried enough weight to suggest he meant it. His grip was firm, though there was no warmth in it, no lingering clasp that might have implied genuine relief. It was the handshake of someone who wanted to acknowledge the moment just enough to move past it. Frank returned the handshake with the same steady pressure, his eyes holding the man's for a second longer than was probably comfortable. Up close, the younger man's face was pale, his jaw tight, and there was something restless in the way his gaze kept sliding away. "You're welcome," Frank said, his tone even. "Glad you're all right." The man nodded quickly, his lips pressing together before he looked over his shoulder toward the police. I should get going." Frank didn't move to stop him, but the speed of the retreat caught his attention. "You sure you don't want to give them a statement?" he asked, tilting his head toward the officers. "It'll help. If that guy turns up again." The younger man hesitated just long enough for Frank to see the answer forming in his mind. "I've already said enough," he replied. His voice was low, and though the words were meant to close the subject, there was an edge to them, not irritation at Frank, but at the situation itself. "It's better if I just go," something in the way he said it told Frank this wasn't just about a roadside fight. The reluctance was too sharp, too deliberate, like the man was following an internal rule he couldn't break. Still, Frank knew better than to press someone who clearly wasn't ready to talk. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "Drive safe." The younger man gave another quick nod and stepped back toward his car. His movements had that clipped efficiency Frank recognized from people trying to leave a place without drawing any more attention to themselves. No fumbling for keys, no extra pauses, just a smooth slide into the driver's seat and the immediate sound of the engine turning over. For a brief moment, their eyes met again through the windshield. There was a flicker there, not gratitude exactly, but maybe acknowledgement. Then the man looked away, checked his mirrors, and eased the car into the slow line of traffic. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the steady procession of vehicles heading toward the city. Frank stayed where he was for a few moments, watching the spot where the car had disappeared. The gravel crunched faintly under his boots as he shifted his weight, and the cool air carried the low murmur of the officers, still speaking by their vehicles. He could still feel the handshake, not in his hand, but in the way it had been given, quick, measured, and careful. It wasn't the kind of thank you that came from someone simply grateful to be safe. Frank had seen real relief before, in places far from this traffic-choked stretch of road, and it was always unguarded, even when words were scarce. This had been different. One of the officers glanced his way, and Frank gave a small nod, signaling he was fine. But in the back of his mind, a question stayed. What kind of trouble leaves a man so intent on not saying too much, even when someone's just stepped in to help him? Whatever it was, Frank knew the story wasn't finished, at least, not for the man who had just driven away in such a hurry. Frank lay on his back, in the dim light of his bedroom, the ceiling fan turning slowly above him, its blades casting a faint rhythmic shadow across the room. But tonight, it only seemed to magnify the noise in his head. He'd gone through the motions of getting ready for bed, shower, clean clothes, lights out, but his mind had never followed the routine. The scene from the roadside kept looping. In his thoughts, each pass revealing some detail he hadn't given much weight to earlier. The way the younger man's eyes had darted to the approaching sirens before quickly looking away. The way his handshake had been firm but deliberately brief, like he wanted to keep the contact to the bare minimum. The way he'd refused to give the officers much of anything, even when it would have been in his interest to do so. Frank shifted onto his side, pulling the thin blanket with him, but the images kept coming. He could see the aggressor's stance, the tension in his shoulders, the glint of the tire iron as it caught the light. It wasn't just random road rage. Frank had broken up enough real fights in his time to know the difference between a sudden outburst and something that had a deeper reason behind it. This had felt personal. Focused, he thought about the younger man's car, a late model sedan, clean but not new, with a small dent near the rear fender that looked like it had been there a while. He remembered how quickly he'd left, slipping into traffic as if he knew exactly how to disappear into it. That wasn't the behavior of someone who'd just been saved from a dangerous situation and wanted to make sure it never happened again. That was the behavior of someone who didn't want to be found. The numbers on the bedside clock glowed faintly, 1:47 a.m. Frank let out a slow breath, the kind that's meant to push thoughts away, but the weight in his chest didn't move. He'd seen men carry secrets before in war, in civilian life, and the younger man's guardedness fit the pattern. Whatever trouble he was in, it wasn't over, and Frank had stepped into the middle of it without even knowing the first thing. About why it started, he closed his eyes, hoping the darkness would push the images back, but instead it sharpened them. The crunch of gravel under the aggressor's boots, the metallic clink when the tire iron hit the ground, the tightness in the younger man's voice when he said, "It's better if I just go." Those words kept turning over in his mind. Better. For who? The fan kept its slow, steady rotation, but the air in the room felt heavier somehow. Frank rolled onto his other side, adjusting the pillow, but sleep still wouldn't come. Part of it was habit, years of conditioning that made it hard to let go of a situation until he'd figured it out. Part of it was something else, a gut feeling that the story on that roadside wasn't finished, and that it might have been luck more than anything else that had kept it from turning worse. By the time the clock's digits shifted to 3:12, Frank had given up on pretending. He sat up, rubbing a hand over his face, and let his eyes adjust to the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The room looked the same as it always did, but in his mind, the shoulder of that road was still right there, the heat of the asphalt, the echo of raised voices, the look in a stranger's eyes that said more in what it didn't reveal than in what it did. He leaned back against the headboard. The blanket pulled at his waist and listened to the stillness of the house. Somewhere in that stillness was the answer, or at least the next piece of the puzzle. But for now, all he could do was keep the details sharp in his memory. Frank sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling in front of him, the morning sunlight just beginning to push through the blinds. The radio had been his usual choice for mornings like this, but he'd turned on the old television, instead, hoping that background chatter from the news might quiet the thoughts that had carried over from the restless night. The anchor's voice drifted in and out as he moved around the kitchen, until a few words caught his attention and pulled him back toward the screen. Wanted for questioning in connection to an ongoing federal investigation, Frank turned, fully toward the television, one hand resting on the back of the chair. The segment cut to a grainy, zoomed-in still image taken from what looked like a street security camera. It showed the side of a man's face, slightly blurred, but the profile was unmistakable. Even in the washed-out colors of the footage, Frank knew exactly who it was, the same younger man he had pulled away from danger on the shoulder of the highway less than 24 hours ago. The caption beneath the image read, "Authorities seek information on person of interest, possible witness or accomplice." The news anchor's voice carried on, calm and detached, explaining that the man was wanted for questioning in relation to an incident that had taken place the previous week. The details were thin: an altercation at a storage facility, unexplained property damage, and conflicting eyewitness accounts. But the key point was clear. Law enforcement was looking for him. Frank sank into his chair, the coffee untouched. Now, and studied the image as it lingered on the screen. The man was going by a different name here. The anchor said it like it was just another fact. Authorities are asking anyone who has seen or interacted with Michael Carver to contact them immediately. Michael Carver. That wasn't the name the officers had written down yesterday. In fact, Frank was almost certain the man hadn't given them a name at all. The image switched to a short clip of a reporter standing outside a nondescript brick building, describing how the investigation had begun. Frank barely heard it. His mind was fixed on the guarded expression from the day before, the quick retreat, the refusal to explain. Now those choices made more sense. The man hadn't been afraid of the aggressor in traffic, at least. Not only him, he'd been afraid of what would happen if anyone official looked too closely. Frank muted the television, the silence settling heavy around him. He leaned back and tried to piece the details together. A fight on the side of the road, a weapon in someone's hand, a man desperate not to talk. And now, a news segment labeling him as a person of interest. It could mean anything. Maybe he was involved, maybe he wasn't. But either way, he was caught up in something bigger than Frank had realized. The camera in the clip had been angled from above, maybe from a streetlight or building corner. That meant someone else, somewhere, had been watching him long before Frank crossed paths with him. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest. He had always believed that acting in the moment was the right thing to do, but now he wondered what stepping in might have set in motion. The news moved on to weather, but Frank didn't turn the sound back on. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, since the segment began, and the light through the blinds now seemed too bright for the quiet unease sitting in the room. He knew what most people would do in his position. Forget it, let the authorities handle it, and move on with the day. But he also knew himself, and the idea of leaving it alone didn't feel like an option. For now, though, all he could do was keep watching. If the story came up again, he'd be ready for whatever detail they gave next. Frank didn't intend to keep the television on. After the morning segment, he had muted it and gone about his usual routine, but the unease from what he'd seen lingered. By mid-morning, the coffee pot was empty, the dishes were stacked neatly in the drainer, and the sun was high enough to wash the kitchen in pale light, yet the muted screen kept drawing his attention. A quiet reminder that something unfinished was hanging in the air. He unmuted it just as the anchor's tone shifted into that deliberate cadence reserved for breaking news. The headline bar along the bottom changed to bold red text, "National Alert, Missing Federal Witness Sought." The screen split into two images. On the left was the same grainy camera still he had seen earlier that morning. On the right was a more polished photograph, clear, well-lit, official. There was no mistaking it. The man he had stepped between and shielded the day before was staring back at him. The guarded expression replaced with the neutral formality of a government-issued ID photo. The anchor spoke with that mix of gravity and detachment. Reading from the teleprompter. Authorities have confirmed that the man in these images, known publicly as Michael Carver, is a missing federal witness tied to an ongoing corruption investigation involving multiple government contractors and municipal officials. Carver, whose legal name has not been released, was scheduled to testify in a closed federal hearing last month, but disappeared before the court date. Frank leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. The words seemed to slow down as he processed them. Missing federal witness. High-profile corruption case. Scheduled to testify and then vanished. Suddenly, yesterday's tense roadside scene took on a sharper, more dangerous outline. The report continued, now featuring brief footage of a courthouse exterior, intercut with images of suited officials walking quickly past reporters. The anchor explained that Carver had been under protective custody for nearly a year after agreeing to provide testimony in a case alleging bribery, embezzlement, and racketeering within a city infrastructure project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The individuals accused were described only as well-connected and resourceful, a phrase that sounded as much like a warning as a description. Frank's eyes stayed on the screen as the reporter described how Carver's disappearance had prompted an internal review of the witness protection measures in place. There was no confirmation of whether his current status was voluntary or if foul play was suspected, but the anchor's choice of words, believed to be at risk, made the implication clear enough. They played a short clip from a federal spokesperson urging anyone with information to come forward. The contact number flashed on the screen. Frank let it linger there, unmoving. He thought about the handshake, the hurried departure, the unwillingness to give the police anything useful. If Carver had wanted to stay hidden, it wasn't just because of fear. It was because every move he made now carried a cost. The segment ended with the anchor reminding viewers that the investigation had drawn national attention due to its potential to implicate several high-ranking officials. As the broadcast shifted to another story, Frank muted the television again. The house fell silent, but the weight of what he had just heard stayed heavy in the air. This was no longer a simple matter of a roadside fight. By stepping in, Frank had crossed paths with someone whose life was balanced between survival and exposure. Someone carrying information powerful enough to draw the kind of attention that didn't fade with time. Frank sat back in his chair. The muted images still flickering across the screen, he had the uneasy sense that what happened yesterday wasn't the end of his involvement. It was the beginning. Frank stayed at the table long after the news segment ended, the television still muted but casting shifting light across the kitchen walls. His coffee cup sat in front of him, cold and untouched, but he didn't bother pouring a fresh one. The words from the broadcast kept replaying in his head, mixing with the sights and sounds from the day before. The metallic glint in the sun, the quick, panicked look in the younger man's eyes, the tire iron dropping onto the asphalt, all of it now framed by the possibility that what he had stepped into wasn't just a roadside dispute. It was an attempt to end something before it could reach a courtroom. He thought about how close he had parked to the fight the seconds it had taken to step out of his truck and speak up. In those moments, he hadn't been considering the larger picture. His instincts had taken over, the same ones that had served him in his army years. Stop the violence, protect the vulnerable, neutralize the threat. But now, with the details laid out in front of him, he saw that timing differently. If he had been even a minute later, the scene might have ended before anyone else arrived. And not in the same way, it wasn't hard to imagine the aggressors. Stance, the grip on the tire iron, hadn't been for show. That was a man committed to following through on whatever he intended to do. And the younger man, Carver, hadn't been armed, hadn't raised a hand to defend himself, hadn't even looked like he was prepared to run. He had looked like someone who knew he'd been cornered. Frank's military experience had taught him to read situations quickly. The more he replayed the scene, the more the pieces lined up. The odd angle of the cars pulled close, but not in the path of normal traffic. The way no other driver had gotten out to help, as if the tension in the air warned them to stay put. The silence from the younger man when Frank had asked if he was all right, none of that fit a random altercation. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. If this was an attempt to silence a federal witness, then the man with the tire iron hadn't just been lashing out. He had been working with a purpose. And that purpose would have ended with no cameras, no witnesses, no chance for Carver to testify. By breaking it up, Frank hadn't just stopped a fight. He might have interfered with the final step in someone's plan. The realization carried weight, a heaviness that settled in his chest. In the Army, actions always had consequences, and stepping into the wrong fight could change the course of an entire mission. Here, in civilian life, it felt no different. He might have thrown himself into the middle of something bigger than either man on that roadside, bigger than himself. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the tiredness from the sleepless night. Catching up with him, his mind kept circling back to one question. If someone had been willing to make such a public move against Carver in the middle of traffic, what would they be willing to do now that their attempt had failed? The thought brought another layer of unease. Whoever had sent that man would now know their plan hadn't worked, and they might be looking for the reason why. Frank had been the most visible reason. He could still picture the aggressors. Face before he fled, the quick glance toward Frank, as if memorizing him. It wasn't paranoia to think that, in a situation like this, stepping in might have put him on the radar of people who didn't like interference. He pushed back from the table, standing slowly. The muted television continued to cycle through headlines, but none of them seemed to matter as much as the one he'd just lived. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. He wasn't sure yet what he would do with the weight of this realization. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over, and walking away from it wouldn't make it disappear. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, not the casual rhythm of a neighbor stopping by. Frank was in the living room, sorting through a small stack of old letters he had been meaning to file away. He froze for a moment, listening. The knock came again, the same measured pace. Years in the service had taught him that there was information in the way someone approached a door, and whoever was outside carried themselves with purpose. The letters down and moved to the window beside the front door, angling the blinds just enough to see without being seen. A dark sedan was parked at the curb, unmarked but too clean, too understated to be just another commuter's car. Two people stood on the porch, both in plain clothes, but their posture and the way they scanned the surroundings set them apart from door to door. The man spoke first, his voice even and professional. "Mr. Delaney." "Frank Delaney." Frank nodded once. "I'm Special Agent Maurice. This is Special Agent Keene. We're with the Department of Justice. We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident you were involved in yesterday afternoon." Frank studied their faces for a beat before replying. The woman, Agent Keene, leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but insistent. "We've reviewed that statement. We just need some clarification. Would you mind if we stepped inside?" He weighed the request, eyes flicking once more to the sedan at the curb before opening the door. They entered without wasted movement. Scanning the room in the way law enforcement did when they stepped into an unfamiliar space, Frank gestured toward the table in the corner of the living room. "We can sit here." Maurice set a small notepad on the table, but didn't open it yet. "We understand you intervened in an altercation on the side of Route 48 yesterday," he began. In your own words, Frank recounted the events plainly, sticking to what he had observed, the cars at odd angles. He left out his growing suspicions about who the younger man was. Maurice listened without interrupting, only jotting a note when Frank described the aggressors, quick glance toward him before fleeing. When Frank finished, any indication of where he was going. Frank shook his head, nothing beyond a quick thank you. He was in a hurry to get out of there. Maurice exchanged a brief look with Keene before leaning in slightly. "Mr. Delaney, the individual you assisted, is connected to an ongoing federal investigation. How small? Did you notice if he seemed injured? Was he carrying anything? Did he look like he was expecting trouble before it started?" Frank took a moment before answering. "He wasn't injured that I could see. No weapon, no bags. But he did look cornered, like he knew what was coming before it happened." Keene's pen moved quickly across her notepad. They asked a few more questions about the aggressor's build, the color of his vehicle, whether Frank had noticed anyone else watching from nearby cars. Frank answered steadily, aware that each detail he gave was being weighed for meaning he couldn't see yet. When they were done, Morris closed his notebook. He slid a plain business card across the table. The print was simple, no extra information beyond a direct line, and their names. Frank nodded and took the card, polite but brisk, and left without further comment. Through the blinds, he watched them return to the sedan, exchange a few words, and drive off down the street. The house felt quieter once they were gone, but not in a comforting way. The conversation had confirmed what the news had hinted this was bigger than a roadside fight. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was officially on the edge of whatever was unfolding. Frank didn't usually offer coffee to strangers, but the agents hadn't left right away. After he agreed to answer a few more questions, they followed him into the kitchen, taking in the modest space with the same quiet observation they had shown in the living room. The coffee pot was half full from earlier in the morning, and Frank set out 3 mugs without asking if they wanted any. Morris nodded his thanks. When Frank poured, Keene simply wrapped her hands around the cup, not drinking yet. They didn't. Jumped straight back into questions. Maurice took a sip, set his mug down, and looked at Frank steadily. "I think it's fair to tell you a little more about what you stepped into yesterday. The man you helped, his name isn't the one he gave. He's currently under protective measures as part of a federal corruption case. Very high stakes, very dangerous people involved." Frank listened without interrupting, his fingers loosely resting around his own mug. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed carried its own weight. Keene leaned forward slightly, her voice measured but firm. "He's a key witness. Without his testimony, a lot of powerful individuals walk free. We're talking about people with enough reach to make a problem disappear before most agencies even get wind of it. Yesterday was likely an attempt to do exactly that." Frank's gaze lowered for a moment as the image of the tire iron flashed back into his mind. "If I hadn't been there," he started, but let the sentence hang. Morris gave a slow nod. "If you hadn't been there, we might be having a very different conversation." He came within seconds of being taken out of the picture entirely. The agent's tone wasn't dramatic. It was matter-of-fact, the way soldiers debrief after a mission. They were laying out the reality so he could understand the stakes. Keene continued, explaining that the witness Carver, though that wasn't his real name, had been relocated multiple times in recent months. Each time, the people after him had managed to track him down. The fact that they were willing to make a move in daylight, in traffic, means they were running out of patience, she said. They didn't care who saw it, as long as they got him out of the way. Frank took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue as he considered their words. He had been in situations before where a moment's delay could have changed everything, but those moments had always been in uniform, in places where danger was expected. This had been an ordinary afternoon in his hometown. Maurice leaned back slightly, studying Frank's face. "We're not here to drag you into the case, Mr. Delaney, but you should be aware you've now been seen by people connected to this. The man who attacked Carver will have reported back to whoever sent him. That makes you a potential complication for them." Frank didn't react outwardly, but he felt the truth of it settle in his gut. "You're saying they might come looking for me?" he said evenly. Keene didn't answer directly. "We're saying you should be cautious. If you notice anyone watching your home or following you, call us immediately." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the pause that followed. Frank looked at the 2 agents, reading in their expressions that they weren't sharing details about the case, the people involved, and just how dangerous they could be. But they weren't here to burden him with the whole file, only to make sure he understood enough to protect himself. Maurice finished his coffee and set the mug down gently. "You did the right thing yesterday. You probably saved his life. But understand, that also means you've stepped onto the edge of a situation that's been building for a long time. We'll do our best to make sure it doesn't spill over into your life. But stay alert." Frank gave a single nod. "I've stayed alert my whole life." Keene offered the faintest hint of a smile at that, though her eyes remained serious. They stood, thanked him again, and left him in the quiet kitchen. The sound of their car pulling away faded, but their words didn't. The coffee had gone cold, but he sat for a long while before moving, replaying every moment of the day before, and wondering just how far this would reach. After the agents left, Frank remained at the kitchen table, staring at the empty mugs and the faint coffee rings they had left behind. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator, but his mind was far from still. What they had told him about the witness, the daylight attack, the powerful people behind it sat uneasily in his thoughts. It wasn't just the information itself, it was the way they had delivered it, measured and precise, giving him only what they needed him to know. He recognized that approach. He had seen it before. During his years in the army, Frank had been attached to more than a few operations that never made the news. Some were labeled as reconnaissance, others as advisory missions, but the reality was always more complicated. He'd been briefed in rooms where the air felt heavier, because everyone present understood that what was said there wouldn't be repeated outside. The way Morris and Keene had spoken, careful but direct, revealing just enough to secure cooperation, without exposing the whole picture, was the same cadence he'd heard from intelligence officers who carried more secrets than they could show. He thought back to one mission in particular, decades ago, in a country whose name rarely came up in public conversation. His unit had been sent to escort a civilian who at first seemed unremarkable, just a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit with a leather satchel. The orders were simple: keep him alive until he reached a certain airfield. It wasn't until later that Frank learned the man had been the sole surviving accountant from a major financial fraud case involving several government officials. People had tried to stop him from leaving the country, some with bribes, others with weapons. The tactics were different, but the intent was the same as what had played out on Route 48 yesterday. Remove the person who could make the case. The memory sharpened as he recalled the look in the accountant's eyes when they finally reached the airfield. It was the same guarded, watchful expression he had seen on Carver's face. The quick way the man had scanned the surroundings before moving, the reluctance to speak more than necessary. Those were not the instincts of an ordinary citizen, they were the habits of someone who had been living under threat for too long. Frank leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window. The agents hadn't said how close Carver had come to disappearing for good, but he could guess. An attack in traffic wasn't just risky, it was desperate. Whoever wanted him silenced was willing to risk public attention because they believed they could control the fallout. That kind of confidence didn't come from amateurs. It came from people with reach, the kind who could make witnesses vanish and bury the investigation that followed. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, piecing together what little he knew. Carver had been tracked despite being under federal protection. That meant someone was feeding information to the wrong side, either inside the system or close enough to it to know where to look. In his army days, they called that a leak in the wiring invisible breach that could undo months of careful planning in a single move. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the agents might not have told him everything, not just to protect the investigation, but to protect him from understanding just how dangerous it could become. If he knew more, he might act on it, and that could put him in the crosshairs. But the truth was, Frank had already started connecting the dots. Years of reading situations in combat had left him with a reflex to assemble the whole picture, even when the pieces were scattered. He stood and moved to the counter, his eyes still distant. Outside, the late afternoon light was fading, shadows stretching across the yard. He knew enough to understand that what had happened on the roadside wasn't an isolated moment. It was part of a chain, one he had seen before in other places, under other names. And now, whether the agents wanted him to or not, he was following that chain back through his own memories, seeing patterns they hadn't spoken aloud by the time he sat down again. The kitchen felt different, as if the air itself carried the weight of those old operations. The lines between past and present had blurred, and he understood with unsettling clarity that what had happened yesterday was the kind of move made when someone was running out of time. And when people like that ran out of time, they became dangerous in ways that no official briefing could fully prepare you for. Frank had just finished rinsing out the coffee mugs when the sound of tires on gravel caught his attention. He glanced out the front window and saw the same unmarked sedan from earlier that day pulling into the driveway. For a moment he wondered if they'd forgotten something, but the look on the agents' faces as they stepped out told him this wasn't just about a stray detail in his statement. Maurice and Keene moved with the same purposeful stride as before, but there was a subtle shift in their expressions, something between urgency and calculation. When he opened the door, Morris didn't waste time on small talk. "Mr. Delaney, we've got a follow-up request. May we come in?" Frank stepped aside, noting how Keene's eyes scanned the street before she crossed the threshold. Once inside, They headed straight for the kitchen, as though the morning's conversation had only been paused, not concluded. Keene set a slim manila folder on the table and slid it toward him. "We've been reviewing what you told us about the man with the tire iron," she began. "Your description is solid: height, build, movements, but we need to narrow it further." She opened the folder to reveal a sheet of printed images, grainy surveillance stills, each showing a different man in mid-motion, most from angles that caught only partial profiles. Morris leaned forward, his tone steady. "We believe one of these men could be the person you saw. If you can help us confirm that, it may move the case forward." Frank studied the page without touching it, letting his eyes move from face to face. A few were immediately wrong. Short, too young, wrong posture. Others required a second look, as if some part of the roadside chaos had blurred their features in his memory. He thought about how the man had moved, the way his shoulders had been set, the stance of someone used to closing the distance quickly. Those things didn't show up in a still image, but they left an impression. He tapped one photograph lightly with his finger. "This one's close," he said, "but I'd need to see him moving to be sure." Keene exchanged a glance with Maurice. Without a word, Maurice reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small tablet, queuing up a short video clip. It was a security feed from what looked like a warehouse parking lot, time-stamped from weeks earlier. The man in the clip walked briskly toward a car, turned slightly toward the camera for a moment, then disappeared from frame. The way he moved compact steps, weight slightly forward, triggered something in Frank's mind. "That's him," Frank said with certainty. "The shoulders, the way he carries himself. I'd bet on it." Morris gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that came from getting exactly what he hoped for. "That helps us more than you know. He's been on our radar, but until now, we didn't have a positive eyewitness." Keene closed the folder and slid it back toward her. "We'll need to put your statement on record for this identification. It may come to court, though we'd do everything possible to protect your involvement." Frank sat back, considering that the prospect of stepping into a federal case was not something he took lightly. But the idea of doing nothing sat even worse with him. "If it helps you stop whoever's behind this, I'll do it," he said plainly. Morris seemed to weigh the response before speaking. "We appreciate that. It's not just your military discipline that impressed us. Today it's how you handled yourself out there. Most people freeze or make things worse. You stepped in and de-escalated before it turned into something fatal. That's not common." The conversation shifted briefly to logistics, how they would arrange for him to view additional materials in a secure location, the channels they'd use to keep in touch. As they spoke, Frank realized they weren't just asking for a one-time identification. They were inviting him, in a careful, unofficial way, into the periphery of their operation. Not as an agent, but as someone whose instincts and experience might prove useful again. Before leaving, Keene paused at the door. "Mr. Delaney, if you agree to this, there's a chance we'll call on you again. We won't ask more than you can give, but this isn't the kind of situation that ends in a week." Frank met her gaze without hesitation. "I've been through long situations before," he said. She gave a brief nod, then followed Morris out to the car. When the sound of the sedan faded down the street, Frank stood for a while in the quiet, feeling the old currents of his army years stirring again. He hadn't sought this, but it had found him, and now he understood sometimes you didn't choose the fight. Sometimes it chose you. The following afternoon, Frank found himself seated in a windowless room inside a federal office building, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights steady and low. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of paper files and disinfectant. Across the table from him sat Agent Keene, while Morris stood near a wall-mounted monitor, holding a remote in one hand. The walls were bare, except for a clock that seemed to tick louder than it should, marking each passing second as they prepared the equipment. Morris began by explaining that they had pulled every available traffic camera angle from the section of Route 48 where the roadside confrontation had taken place. Some of the footage was grainy, others clearer, but they had yet to extract anything that could definitively link the aggressor to the man Frank had identified the day before. "We want you to look at these with the same focus you had out there," Maurice said. "Sometimes a trained eye catches what the rest of us overlook." The first clip rolled, showing an aerial perspective from a high-mounted pole camera. Frank leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, studying the faint shapes of vehicles moving along the congested roadway. They slowed the playback as the two cars pulled toward the shoulder, angled sharply in a way that blocked part of the lane. A few frames later, the figures emerged, two men stepping out aggressively, one of them advancing on the other. From this distance, the details were indistinct, but Frank noted the slight lag in the aggressor's left leg, the kind of subtle hitch that came from an old injury or uneven strength. "Stop there," Frank said, pointing at the screen. Keen froze the frame. "See that step? He's compensating for something in his knee or hip. If you check medical records or prior arrest footage, you might find that same gait." Morris scribbled a note without comment. The next angle came from a different camera, mounted closer to the street. The resolution was sharper, enough to see the metallic flash in the man's hand as he raised it. "Back it up to seconds," Frank requested. They did, and he motioned toward the moment just before the weapon became visible. He switches grip. Here most people hold a tire iron like a lever. He's holding it like an impact tool. For a short swing, that tells you he's used it in that way before. Not improvisation. Training of some sort, maybe not formal, but practiced. They moved through the footage frame by frame. At one point, Frank spotted a detail neither agent had mentioned, a small emblem on the side of the aggressor's jacket, partially visible when he turned toward the road. It was faint, but to Frank's eyes, the circular shape with a bar across. The middle looked like a logo, possibly from a defunct automotive shop or a local motorcycle club. "Magnify that," he said. The image blurred further, but the outline remained. That might be nothing, or it might be the kind of thing you can cross-reference against regional affiliations. Another angle showed the man retreating toward his vehicle after Frank had stepped in. Here, Frank noticed the aggressors, glances not toward Frank. Not toward the crowd of drivers still trapped in their cars, but up and down the road, scanning for something. "He's looking for a partner," Frank observed. Either he had backup that never arrived, or he was checking for a tail. That's not the mindset of someone in a spontaneous road rage incident. He came there with a plan. Morris paused. The playback and looked over. "We didn't see that," he admitted. "We thought he was just looking for an escape route." Frank shook his head. "No, that kind of scanning is different. It's patterned. He's watching for movement, not open space." They finished the review with the final camera, positioned farther down the road, which caught the aggressor's car speeding away. Frank noted the slight list of the vehicle to the right side, suggesting uneven suspension or a heavy load in the trunk. "If you find that car, check the rear shocks," he advised. "Might give you more than you expect." When the clips ended, the room was quiet, except for the ticking clock. Keen closed her notebook, her expression thoughtful. "You just gave us 4 leads we didn't have an hour ago," she said. Maurice nodded in agreement, adding, "This is why we asked you in. You're reading behavior and movement the way some people read headlines." Frank leaned back, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders from sitting so long. "You spend enough years watching people when it matters. You start noticing the things they don't mean to show," he replied. The agents exchanged another glance, and Frank could tell they were already planning the next step. He also understood something else, that whatever this case was, it had just moved forward, and now his role in it was no longer a matter of chance. The following morning, Frank was back in his kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm when the phone rang. The caller ID was blocked, but the clipped voice on the other end was unmistakably Agent Morris. He asked if Frank could come down to the office again. They had something to show him. An hour later, Frank was walking through the same gray corridors, past security checkpoints, until he reached a smaller conference room with a single folder on the table. Keen was already there, leaning against the wall, arms folded. Maurice slid the folder toward him without opening it. "We ran the footage against several databases. Combined with your identification and the details you pointed out, we've got a confirmed match." Frank flipped the cover back and saw a photograph clear. This time of the man he'd faced on the side of the road. The jawline, the set of the shoulders, even the faint scar across the eyebrow were exactly as he remembered. Beneath the photo was a name, Viktor Soronov. Keen began explaining, Soronov wasn't just a violent drifter or petty criminal. He was a known enforcer tied to a Eurasian organized crime network operating on both coasts. Their activities ranged from smuggling and extortion to contract hits. His presence in the city was already concerning to federal investigators. But what caught Frank's attention was a line further down the dossier, previously identified in Conflict Zone 2006-2007. Frank's mind pulled him back almost 2 decades. In the summer of 2006, his unit had been assigned to an operation in Eastern Europe, assisting local forces in dismantling a weapons trafficking route that was feeding insurgent groups in the Middle East. He remembered a night operation near a warehouse by the dock's cold wind, the smell of diesel and salt water. They'd intercepted a shipment before it could be moved inland. In the confusion, a tall man with a compact build had slipped out the back, disappearing into the maze of shipping containers. The description given later by local intel had been vague, but the photo in front of him now brought the memory into sharp focus. He tapped the image with 2 fingers. I've seen him before, not here overseas. Dockside operation, summer of '06. He was there the night we shut down a shipment of military-grade hardware headed for the wrong hands. Morris raised his eyebrows. "That's not in our file," he said. "You're sure?" "Sure enough to bet on," Frank replied. He moved the same way then as he did on that roadside, forward-leaning, quick but controlled, always looking for a gap. Keene stepped forward, her voice more measured now. "If that's accurate, it explains a lot." Soronov disappeared from our radar for years after that period. He resurfaced only recently, working jobs for higher-level figures in the organization. If he was on that road with the federal witness, this wasn't random. He was likely contracted to take him out. Before trial, Frank studied the rest of the file. There were surveillance stills from various ports and warehouses, each showing Soronov with different associates. Some faces were blurred, others fully blacked out. There was also a record of his movements through countries known for being safe havens for fugitives. Frank noted the pattern. Every location was tied to a corridor for moving either people or weapons. "That's why he didn't panic when I stepped in," Frank said quietly. "He's worked in places where everything goes bad fast. He's used to adjusting mid-job." Morris nodded. "We believe your recognition of him could strengthen our case, but it also changes the security situation for you. If his network finds out who disrupted that encounter, you could be a target." Frank sat back, letting that sink in. It wasn't the first time he'd been on someone's list, but it had been years since that kind of danger had touched his civilian life. He met Morris's eyes. "I didn't ask for this, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw. You'll have my statement." Keene closed the folder, her expression unreadable. "Then we move forward. But understand, Mr. Delaney is bigger than a roadside fight. You've stepped back into a game you once walked away from." Frank didn't respond right away. He looked at the sealed folder, then at the agents, the name, the face, the history. It was all coming full circle, and he knew that whatever came next wouldn't be something he could walk away from quickly. Frank was driven in an unmarked sedan through a part of the city he rarely visited anymore, the kind of neighborhood where the streets narrowed and the buildings leaned inward as though eavesdropping. The agents hadn't told him exactly where. They were going only that he'd need to leave his truck behind and ride with them. Keene drove while Morris sat beside her, both silent except for the occasional low murmur into their earpieces. Frank recognized the rhythm of their movements, the subtle checks of mirrors, the small deviations from their route to make sure no one was following. It was the same kind of pattern he'd learned years ago during convoy runs in unstable regions. They stopped outside a nondescript brick building with a faded awning, its windows dusty and uninviting. Inside, the air was cooler, tinged with the faint scent of stale coffee and cleaning solvent. They took a service elevator down instead of up, descending into a basement level that opened into a corridor with peeling paint and steel doors spaced evenly along the walls. At the third door, Maurice produced a keycard, swiped it, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small but orderly, a table in the center, 2 chairs on each side, a single lamp casting a cone of light downward. In the corner sat a water cooler and a stack of disposable cups. Against the far wall stood the man Frank had pulled from the roadside fight. Dressed now in plain jeans and a dark sweatshirt, 2 other men in plain clothes stood nearby, both with the kind of posture that told Frank they were armed even if their jackets hid it. The witness looked different out of the adrenaline and chaos. His hair was still cropped short, but he had the drawn, alert expression of someone who had been moving between hiding places for too long. His eyes met Frank's briefly before shifting away as though unsure how to bridge the moment. Keene stepped between them and spoke in a level voice. "Mr. Delaney, this is Daniel Rykov. That's his real name." Frank absorbed the name, the syllables fitting uneasily against the memory of their brief handshake on the roadside. Rykov nodded slightly, but said nothing at first. One of the guards shifted his stance, and the hum of the air vent above seemed louder in the pause. Finally, Rykov spoke, his voice quieter than Frank expected. "I owe you more than a thank you, but that's all I've been able to give so far. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask. You just stepped in." Frank kept his hands resting on the back of a chair. Didn't need to know. Someone was about to get hurt. That was enough. Rykov exhaled slowly and glanced at the agents. Before continuing, "You should understand what happened out there wasn't an accident. I was being moved between safe locations when the driver decided he wanted to make some money. He called someone, gave them our position, and pulled over like there was a problem with the car. By the time I realized, the other man was already there." Keene added, "The one you confronted, Soronova, has been tied to the organization. Rykov used to work for. He's the primary witness in a federal corruption case involving arms, shipments, and political payoffs. His testimony is critical." Frank studied Rykov more closely now. The guarded look in his eyes wasn't just fear. It was the weight of knowing too much, the knowledge that people with reach and resources wanted him gone. "You've been running." "For a while," Frank said. Rykov gave a faint nod. 2 years, new cities, new names, every few months. I stopped expecting strangers to help. They sat at the table then, with Morris taking a seat across from Frank and the guards staying. Close to the walls, Rykov spoke in fragments, careful not to spill details the agents hadn't cleared. But Frank could read between the lines. The night on the road had been closer to his last than either of them had realized. At one point, Rykov looked directly at Frank and said, "When you stepped in, I thought you were one of them at first. Then I saw the way you moved controlled, watching my attacker's hands instead of my face. That's not how civilians react." Frank didn't confirm or deny, only replied, "Old habits." The meeting ended with no dramatic handshake or promises, just a quiet understanding that the circle of people Rykov could trust had grown by one. As the agents led Frank back toward the elevator, he glanced over his shoulder. Rykov was still standing there, shoulders slightly straighter than when Frank had first walked in, like the simple act of being seen and truly seen had restored something he'd been losing piece by piece. Back in the small, windowless room, the air felt heavier than before. The agents had stepped to one side, speaking quietly into their earpieces. Leaving Frank seated across from Rykov, the hum of the fluorescent light above was constant, faintly. Irritating, but neither man seemed to notice. Rykov sat with his elbows on the table, fingers laced loosely, his gaze fixed somewhere just past Frank's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, like someone measuring every word against the risk of saying it. "This case, it's about a system built to bleed money from military budgets and funnel it into private hands." His eyes shifted to meet Frank's, and a lot of those hands belonged to people who never saw a battlefield but made their fortunes from the ones who did. Frank didn't respond immediately. He'd heard variations of that story before, during his years in uniform and after. "Military contracting?" Frank asked, even though he knew the answer. Rykov nodded. "Front companies posing as suppliers. In the field, they took contracts worth hundreds of millions and split the profits across shell corporations. Some of those parts were meant for vehicles you might have used." Frank felt his jaw tighten. He remembered the frustration of waiting for shipments that never arrived. In a combat zone, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a risk measured in human lives. "How high does it go? That's why they want me gone. I was their operations man in the middle. I signed off on inventory, coordinated logistics. When the investigation started closing in, I made the choice to come forward. They called me a traitor before I even left." The agents had finished their quiet exchange and moved closer, but they didn't interrupt. Maurice watched Frank carefully, as though gauging his reaction. Keene's expression was harder to read, but her focus was clearly on what Rykov was saying. "I've been testifying in pieces," Rykov continued. "Each time I give them more, they lock it down, cross-check it, build the case." "The last part what?" I haven't given yet is the link between the fraudulent contracts and a handful of senior officials who approved them despite the red flags. Once that's out, the people in the shadows can't hide behind intermediaries anymore. Mind was already moving through the implications. If Rykov was telling the truth, this wasn't just about stolen money, it was about missions compromised, lives endangered, and a chain of corruption that could extend into places few dared to investigate. He'd seen enough over his career to know that the machinery of war wasn't just fueled by patriotism or strategy. There were always those who treated it as an industry, and soldiers were just the consumers of their defective products. "Do you have proof?" Frank asked finally. Rykov's mouth tightened. "Yes. Copies of shipping manifests, internal memos, payment records, routed through foreign banks. But they're encrypted and stored in a way that only I can access. If I vanish, so does the evidence." Frank understood the unspoken part. That meant every attempt on Rykov's life wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Without him, the entire case would collapse, and the people behind it would keep operating. The room was silent for a moment, except for the hum of the light. Frank leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I've seen men die because a shipment didn't show up on time, because a replacement part snapped under stress. If you're telling me that was because someone wanted a bigger cut, then I understand why they're afraid of you talking." Rykov's eyes met his again, and for the first time since they'd been reintroduced, there was no guardedness in his expression. "Job?" Maurice cleared his throat quietly, as if to bring the conversation back into official territory. They knew his background, knew the effect it would have, and as Frank sat back in his chair, he realized that his role in this had shifted. He was now connected to the truth. Rykov carried on to the danger that came with it. Frank hadn't planned on staying at the safe house longer than necessary. But when Morris stepped out to take a call, and Keene drifted toward the door to check the perimeter, Rykov spoke again. His tone different, less formal, almost tentative. "You don't remember me, do you?" Frank gave him a puzzled look. "Should I?" Rykov gave a small shrug, though his eyes didn't waver. "Not directly. Different name back then, different job. But I was there, Afghanistan, 2006, Kandahar province. You were with a convoy heading toward the Arghandab district." Frank's brow furrowed. That year had been one of the rougher deployments, full of patrols that seemed endless and missions that blurred together. "You were in country?" he asked carefully. Rykov nodded, embedded with a civilian logistics team. "Officially, we were just moving supplies. Unofficially, we were watching supply lines for infiltration. The company I worked for at the time had contracts with the Army, and our trucks ran the same routes as yours." Frank's mind started pulling at half-buried memories. There had been a long one when his convoy was delayed outside, a small walled compound because the route ahead had been compromised. Reports had come in of a roadside device planted on the main stretch. Someone had passed the warning along before they reached it. At the time, Frank hadn't questioned where the intel came from. The Army rarely explained those things to the soldiers running the missions. Rykov leaned forward, his voice steady but quiet. "That day, my team intercepted chatter. We weren't supposed to act on it directly. Wasn't our job to interfere with military operations, but I pushed it through a contact in your chain of command anyway. I don't know if they ever told you where the warning came from, but without it, you would have driven right into an ambush. The device was set under a culvert. There were shooters positioned on the ridge. It wouldn't have been a roadside explosion, it would have been a full kill zone." Frank sat back slowly, his gaze fixed on the man across from him. In the years since he'd thought about that near miss only in passing, one of many days where luck had seemed to be on their side, he'd never put a face or a name to the person who might have tipped the balance. "You're saying that was you?" "I'm saying I was part of the reason you're here now," Rykov replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "It wasn't personal back then. You were just a soldier on the route, but I knew what would happen if we stayed quiet. I'd seen it before." The weight of the admission settled between them. Frank's mind replayed the scene. Convoy, the quiet tension in the air, the eventual reroute that had seemed like a minor inconvenience at the time. He remembered the look on the driver's face when they heard later what they'd avoided. It wasn't the first time danger had been near, but knowing now that the man in front of him had been on the other end of that decision, it shifted something. "You could have kept that to yourself," Frank said after a moment. Rykov gave a faint smile. "Maybe I didn't want you to think you stepped into my fight out there on the highway for nothing. You didn't just save me. In a way, I'm returning the favor just later than most people would expect." Frank considered the irony. Years apart, different countries, different circumstances, and yet their paths had crossed twice, once unseen, once in the middle of chaos. Both times, one had pulled the other away from something worse. When Morris returned, the conversation slid back into procedural matters, the tone formal again. But Frank kept glancing at Rykov, the knowledge of that long-ago connection sitting quietly in the back of his mind. He hadn't needed another reason to want the man to make it through this alive. Now he had one anyway. The days after the safe house meeting moved in a blur of headlines and news alerts. What had been a local curiosity, the brief mention of a roadside altercation, was now part of a much larger national story. Every network seemed to have a segment. On the corruption case, complete with stock footage of military convoys, grainy images of shipping containers, and dramatic graphics of money trails leading to shadowy silhouettes. The man Frank knew as Rykov was at the center of it all, though the coverage never used his current location or his exact name. The press called him the key witness or the whistleblower, and every mention carried a tone of both admiration and danger. Frank kept the television on more than usual, not out of any desire for the noise, but because he wanted to track the narrative. Reporters speculated about who had tried to harm the witness, throwing out vague theories and unnamed sources. None of them mentioned the fight on the highway in detail. When it came up at all, it was reduced to a single sentencing incident involving the witness with a passerby intervening. That passerby was never named. Late one afternoon, Morris called him directly. His voice carried the clipped tone of someone juggling too many moving parts. "Frank, we need you to keep your head down for the time being. No interviews, no statements to anyone who isn't us." Frank asked if someone had already tried to find him. Morris confirmed that a few reporters had been sniffing around, piecing together the location and timing of the highway incident. "If they get your name, you become part of the story," Morris said, "and right now, the story doesn't need another target." It wasn't the first time Frank had been asked to keep things to himself. Military service had taught him when to speak and when to step back, but this felt different. Back then, silence was about operational security. Now, it was about controlling the public's appetite for details that might get people hurt. He agreed, without hesitation, though part of him bristled at the idea of being erased from a moment that mattered. His coffee at the kitchen table, a news crew van parked at the far end of his street. They didn't come to the door, but he caught the glint of a camera lens when he stepped outside to bring in the mail. The van moved on a few minutes later, but the point had been made. They were looking. Even if they didn't know exactly what for, calls from old Army friends started trickling in. Most had seen enough in the coverage to know something was up, though they couldn't pin it to Frank. He kept his answers vague, steering the conversation towards safe topics. A couple of them pressed harder, their curiosity sharpened by the fact that he wasn't denying anything outright. He deflected with a tired laugh and said he was just keeping busy by the end of the week. The national conversation had shifted into overdrive. Editorials debated the implications of the case. Politicians gave carefully worded statements, and every talking head seemed certain they knew how it would all play out. Through it all, Frank's role stayed in the shadows. Exactly as the agents had requested, he found the quiet both a relief and a strain. It meant no one was camped outside his door or shoving a microphone in his face, but it also meant swallowing the knowledge that he had been there when it mattered most and couldn't acknowledge it. In some ways, it was like certain missions. He'd been part of overseas ones that never made it into any official record but had shaped outcomes just the same. When Morris checked in again, he explained that the media frenzy would only intensify as the trial date approached. They'll circle the courthouse, they'll chase the attorneys, and they'll want the human interest angle. You're that angle, Frank, which is why we can't let them have you yet. Frank didn't argue. He understood the reasoning, but after the call ended, he sat for a long while. The television muted in the background, thinking about how stories were told and who got to tell them. For now, his part in this one would remain unspoken. But he also knew that staying out of sight wouldn't keep him out of the fight knot, with the trial drawing near and the stakes as high as they were. It was late evening when the tension broke. The safe house had settled into its usual rhythm-quiet hum of the refrigerator. The occasional creak from the old floorboards, muted voices from a news program playing in another room. Frank was sitting at the small dining table, a half-finished mug of coffee cooling beside him, while Rykov worked through some paperwork in the corner. The agents had rotated out earlier, leaving them alone for what was supposed to be just a few hours. The first sound was subtle, almost easy to dismiss, a faint scrape near the back door, like metal brushing wood. Frank's head came up immediately. Rykov noticed the change in his posture and froze mid-sentence. The scrape came again, followed by a quiet click that didn't belong to any part of the house's settling. Frank was on his feet in an instant, his military instincts pushing him into motion before any plan fully formed. He gestured for Rykov to stay low and moved toward the small hallway that connected the kitchen to the rear entrance. Another faint sound, a slow, deliberate push on the doorknob, confirmed it. Someone was outside, testing the entry. The house wasn't built for defense. It was just an unremarkable rental in a quiet neighborhood, chosen precisely because it blended in. But its anonymity only worked if no one knew who was inside. Frank's mind ran through possibilities: curious neighbor, opportunistic burglar, or something much more dangerous given the trial looming ahead. He crouched near the door, listening. There were at least 2 sets of footsteps outside. One moved toward the window beside the door, another stayed near the frame. They weren't talking, which told him they knew enough to avoid making noise. That alone ruled out random thieves. He turned to Rykov, who had moved closer with a length of cord. From a duffel bag, they exchanged a glance. No panic, just a mutual understanding. This was a problem they couldn't ignore. Frank motioned toward the side window in the living room. It was their best chance to assess without revealing their position. Creeping forward, they kept to the shadows and peered out through the narrow gap between the curtain and the wall. A dark sedan was parked 2 houses down, engine running, headlights off. The 2 figures outside were dressed in plain clothes, but carried themselves with the kind of alertness Frank had seen in trained men. One of them reached into his jacket, and the faint glint of metal caught Frank's eye. No time to wait. Frank moved back toward the kitchen and quietly slid the deadbolt into place on the back door, then grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the table and wedged it under the knob. Rykov positioned himself near the hallway with the cord wound tightly around his hands, ready to trip or restrain anyone who made it inside. The next sound was more forceful, a sharp rattle at the door, followed by the unmistakable thud of a shoulder hitting it. The frame shuddered, but held. Frank stayed close, his weight braced against the chair. Another hit came, harder this time. He knew it was only a matter of time before the door gave way. Then came the break in the rhythm, the faint echo of sirens in the distance. Whoever was outside heard it too. The pounding stopped, replaced by hurried footsteps retreating across the yard. Through the side window, Frank saw them moving fast toward the sedan. It rolled away without headlights, turning the corner before the patrol cars could arrive. When the agents finally swept in minutes later, weapons drawn, they found the back door scuffed and splintered at the latch. Frank explained what had happened in short, clipped sentences, Rykov filling in the gaps. The agents exchanged a look that told Frank they weren't surprised, only frustrated it had come so close. After the house was cleared, they recommended moving Rykov to another location immediately. But as they packed up, Frank noticed something in the man's expression. It wasn't just relief, it was a steady, quiet trust. Whatever history had connected them before, tonight had proven they could rely on each other under pressure. For Frank, it was a reminder that no matter how much he tried to stay on the sidelines, situations like this had a way of pulling him right back into the center. The morning of the testimony broke gray and cold, the kind of weather that seemed too quiet a city's usual rush. Frank arrived at the courthouse early, parking his old pickup several blocks away to avoid drawing attention. He walked the rest of the distance, keeping his pace slow, blending in with the steady trickle of people heading toward the tall stone building. By the time he reached the security checkpoint, the line had grown, a mix of reporters, legal staff, and curious onlookers, hoping to witness what the news had been calling one of the most significant corruption trials in years. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The corridors hummed with low voices, shoes clicking over polished floors. the occasional metallic rattle from the belt-fed X-ray machines at security. Frank passed unnoticed, dressed simply in a worn jacket and plain shirt, carrying nothing but his wallet and the folded slip of paper with his seating assignment. The agents had arranged it so he could be present without drawing attention. He had no official role here at least not one anyone in the courtroom needed to know about. The courtroom itself was larger than he'd expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in a cold, diffuse light. Rows of benches filled quickly, the front occupied by the press, their cameras and notepads ready. Frank took a seat toward the back, near the wall, where he could see the whole room without being seen himself. From there, the witness stand was clearly in view, just a few steps from the judge's bench. When Rykov entered, flanked by two federal marshals, the room shifted subtly. Conversations quieted, a few heads turned sharply, and the clicking of camera shutters began in earnest. He looked different from the man Frank had met on the roadside weeks ago, cleaner cut, wearing a tailored suit, his posture straighter. But Frank could see the controlled tension in his movements, the careful way he scanned the room before sitting down. It wasn't fear exactly, but the kind of heightened awareness Frank remembered from soldiers who knew they were still in the middle of the fight, even if the setting had changed. The prosecutor began with methodical questions, building a timeline of events that stretched back months. Rykov's voice was steady, measured, but each statement he made seemed to draw a reaction from the defense table. The men sitting there, lawyers in sharp suits, their client, a broad-shouldered figure with an expression of studied disinterest, watched him closely. Frank didn't need a transcript to understand that the testimony was cutting deep. Hours passed. In a slow rhythm, exhibits were introduced, photographs and documents projected onto screens for the jury to see. Each time, Rykov explained their context, linking them to meetings, contracts, and names that were already making headlines. It wasn't just about fraud. It was about contracts that had left soldiers in dangerous situations overseas, gear that failed when it mattered most, and the quiet funneling of money into hands it was never meant to reach. Frank listened with a tightness in his chest, hearing echoes of things he'd seen in his own service only, now laid out under oath, in a room where the truth carried legal weight. During a short recess, the marshals kept Rykov close, walking him to a side room without letting him linger in the open. Frank stayed seated, watching the defense team huddle together, their expressions betraying more concern than they probably intended. He had no doubt they were recalculating, trying to find a way to blunt the impact of what was unfolding. When the session resumed, the cross-examination began. The defense attorney's tone was sharp, his questions aimed at undermining credibility, at painting Rykov as unreliable, biased, or compromised. But Rykov held steady, answering each question with the same even tone he'd used before. Frank knew how hard that was, how much restraint it took not to react when someone was trying to shake you in front of a crowd by the time the judge adjourned for the day. The air in the courtroom felt different. There was no clear victory yet, but the foundation had been laid. The marshals moved Rykov out quickly, avoiding the reporters clustered near the doors. Frank waited until most of the room had emptied before standing, sliding his hands into his jacket pockets and making his way down the aisle. No one stopped him. No one even seemed to notice he'd been there at all. But as he stepped outside, into the cold afternoon light, he felt the weight of what he'd just witnessed. The man whose life he'd stumbled into protecting on that crowded stretch of road had just faced down a room full of people who would have preferred him gone. And Frank, quietly in the back, had seen enough to know it wasn't over yet. The courthouse was surrounded by a restless crowd long before the doors opened. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes tilted toward the sky. Reporters rehearsing lines into microphones as camera operators adjusted their shots. Police had set up barriers along the sidewalks, keeping the swelling mass of spectators and protesters at bay. Frank arrived early again, his pickup tucked into a side street where it wouldn't be noticed, and joined the slow-moving stream of people. Filing through the security checkpoint, inside, the air was thicker than it had been on testimony day, the tension more condensed, like the moments before a storm breaks. The courtroom filled quickly. The jury had been deliberating since the previous afternoon, and word that they had reached a verdict spread fast. Frank chose the same seat as before, halfway back along the wall, where he could see without being seen. The front rows were packed with press, their equipment ready to capture whatever happened in the next few minutes. Across the aisle, the defendant sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, but his eyes fixed on a spot on the polished wood surface. In front of him, his attorneys whispered to one another, glancing occasionally toward the door through which the jury would soon enter. When the bailiff called for order, the conversations and shuffling stopped. The judge appeared first, his black robe swaying slightly as he took his seat. A moment later, the door at the side opened, and the 12 jurors filed in. Frank studied their faces. Some looked impassive, others worn from the weight of the decision they were about to announce. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm but tight expression, carried a folded slip of paper in her hand. The clerk took the paper, glanced at it briefly, and handed it to the judge. The room was silent, except for the faint creak of benches. As people leaned forward, the judge unfolded the paper and began to read, his voice steady, each word deliberate. On the first count, guilty. On the second, guilty. One by one, the list continued guilty on all counts. There was no outburst, no loud reaction from the gallery, just a collective intake of breath, a ripple of murmurs, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. At the defense table, the attorneys' faces hardened, and the defendant's hands clenched briefly before he forced them flat against the table again. On the other side, the prosecution team allowed themselves the faintest nods, a quiet acknowledgement of the outcome without celebrating openly. Frank's gaze shifted toward the small side door where the witness had entered during testimony. He wasn't in the room now. The agents had kept him away from the public eye since his appearance on the stand. Frank knew the verdict would be a relief, but it didn't erase the risks. A conviction in a case like this meant that powerful people had been exposed, and some of them would have the resources and motivation to make sure certain witnesses disappeared as the judge thanked the jury for their service and began the procedural steps to conclude the trial. Frank's attention drifted. He could hear the commotion beginning to build outside, the chants and shouts of those gathered spilling faintly through the walls. The bailiff announced the court was adjourned, and the room came alive with movement. Reporters pushed toward. The aisle lawyers collected papers, and the defendant was led away in handcuffs. His expression unreadable, Frank stayed seated until most of the benches had emptied. He had no role to play here in the public sense, no microphone to step in front of, no statement to give. But as he rose and walked toward the exit, he carried the knowledge that his presence weeks ago on that crowded stretch of road had helped lead to this moment. Without that intervention, the witness might not have lived to testify. Without the testimony, the verdict might have been very different. Outside, the cold air met him like a wall. Police kept the crowd separated from the courthouse steps, but the noise was constant cheers from one side, angry shouts from another. Frank moved quietly along the edge, slipping away toward the side street where his truck waited. He didn't linger to watch the news crew swarm the attorneys or to see the flashes of cameras capturing the moment for the evening broadcasts. The trial was over, but the story wasn't finished. Somewhere, the witness was. Hearing the news, maybe in a safe house, maybe already being moved again. Somewhere else, people who had just lost in court were calculating their next move. Frank had lived long enough to know that justice in a courtroom didn't always mean safety in the days that followed. As he started his truck and pulled into the slow-moving traffic, he kept one eye on the mirrors, the old instincts still awake. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long streaks of gold across the cracked pavement as Frank guided his old pickup onto the familiar stretch of road. The engine's steady hum blended with the soft rattle of tools in the box behind the seat, a sound he had grown used to over the years. Traffic was thick, just as it always was at this hour, brake lights flaring in a slow, uneven rhythm ahead of him. It was the same commute he had made countless times, yet it felt different now, as if the road itself held the memory of what had happened weeks before. The radio was on, low-tuned to a station playing songs from decades past. Between tracks, a news update briefly mentioned the verdict from the high-profile trial. Now fading from the headlines as news stories took its place, Frank didn't need the reminder. He had been there, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching the weight of truth land in a way most people would never see up close. Now, though, there was no urgency in his drive, no sirens in the distance, no adrenaline sharpening his focus, only the slow-moving line of cars and the knowledge of what had been prevented, he passed the spot where it had all started. The patch of shoulder where he had pulled over without thinking, where two men had stood in the middle of something dangerous while the world around them kept moving. From the driver's seat, it looked so ordinary now, just a strip of asphalt edged by weeds, littered with the small debris of daily life, nothing to mark that on another day. It had been the scene of a decision that changed the course of someone else's future. Frank's hands rested lightly on the wheel, but his mind drifted. He thought about the witness, about the guarded gratitude in that first handshake, and the way the man's eyes had shifted, measuring him, uncertain whether to trust. He thought about the agents in his kitchen, explaining just how close they had come to losing him forever. And he thought about the fact that, if not for one wrong turn or one moment of hesitation, the outcome might have been entirely different. A horn blared behind him, snapping him out of his thoughts. The line of cars inched forward, and he eased his foot onto the gas, the pickup responding with its usual groan before settling back into its steady pace. The city around him was the same as it had always been: strip malls, gas stations, the smell of asphalt from a road crew working half a mile ahead, but inside, he felt a shift. He had spent years since leaving the army trying to blend in, to live quietly, to avoid stepping into the kind of situations that once defined him. And yet, when it came down to it, the instincts hadn't dulled. Didn't think of what happened as heroism. It was simply the right thing to do, the thing he had been trained to do, the thing he knew he could not walk away from. Still, there was something in it that lingered, a reminder that purpose doesn't vanish when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it waits for the right moment to surface again. The traffic began to thin as he left the busier streets behind and turned toward his neighborhood. The houses were familiar, the sidewalks empty, except for a couple of kids riding bikes along the curb. The air smelled faintly of barbecue from somewhere nearby. Frank slowed as he approached his driveway. The gravel crunching under the tires as he pulled in, he shut off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet, watching the light fade across the front yard. It had been an ordinary day in so many ways, and yet, as he stepped out of the truck and closed the door behind him, he knew that the same road he had just traveled would never feel entirely routine again. Somewhere out there, a man was alive and free because of that afternoon. Somewhere else, the people who had tried to silence him were living with the knowledge that they had failed. And here, in this quiet driveway, Frank felt the weight of both. Walked up the steps, the screen door creaking open in the same familiar way. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the stillness waiting inside.